first, we're going to hear from Asa, who has just written about an apparent attempt by the British government-backed broadcaster to smear prominent Palestinians in the UK. Asa, give us a sense of the significance of this story and what you'll be presenting.
Thank you, Laura. Why is the BBC relying on Israeli spies and soldiers for its reporting on Palestine? That was the question foremost on my mind on Monday evening as I watched the latest episode of Panorama, the British government broadcaster's supposedly flagship investigative news program. Panorama has run since 1953 and airs at primetime slots on the top free-to-air domestic British TV channel BBC One. The episode was ominously titled Hamas's Secret Financial Empire. It claimed to have obtained, quote, access to some of Hamas's most closely guarded financial secrets. And the BBC trailed that it was going to expose its global network in opposition to Israel and its existence. But in the end, this program was a total flop. There was almost nothing new in it, and it relied heavily and quite openly on Israeli military and intelligence sources. And you saw the footage there of the reporter John Ware being embedded with the Israeli army. The so-called global empire that the BBC's reporter John Ware claimed to have exposed in the end amounted to dubious allegations about a single company in Turkey, based on a document which Ware explained, quote, that Israeli intelligence say are from inside Hamas. In other words, Israeli spies gave them this spreadsheet. The program also interviewed a man called 𝐐𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜, the former head of interrogations for the Shin Bet, as well as Mossad spy Udi Levy. Ware didn't name the Shin Bet, and 𝐄𝐿𝐵 was described on screen only as a former, quote, security agency official. But both the Shin Bet and Mossad are notorious for their torture and murder of Palestinians, both armed and unarmed alike. And these men, of course, pushed Israeli propaganda narratives about the evils of Hamas and the supposed need to stop humanitarian aid to Gaza. That John Ware would be pushing the agenda of spy agency shouldn't come as a surprise. Back in 1987, Ware reported for another Panorama documentary, which attempted to discredit Colin Wallace, a former British Army intelligence officer turned whistleblower. Wallace exposed British and loyalist wrongdoing in the north of Ireland, including a dirty tricks campaign against the British Labour government, which at the time wanted to negotiate with the IRA. British intelligence actually framed Colin Wallace for murder, and he was later exonerated and released, but not before being smeared by the establishment and by John Ware as a fantasist. More recently, as I explained in an article which I wrote earlier this month, John Ware is the same reporter who was behind the discredited Panorama episode titled Is Labour Anti-Semitic?, which played a part in the 2019 electoral defeat of Jeremy Corbyn, the Palestine solidarity activist, who was leader of the main British opposition party at the time. Now, in that episode, Ware claimed to expose Corbyn's Labour for its supposedly endemic anti-Semitism, interviewing people who were supposedly brave Jewish members of the party who had allegedly been the victims of racism. But it turned out that 8 out of the 10 anonymous Jewish speakers in the episode, claiming to have been the victim of anti-Semitism in the party, were actually current or recent senior figures in the Jewish labor movement, a pro-Israel lobby group, which was extremely close to the Israeli embassy. In fact, the very first speaker in the film, that woman we saw there, was Ella Rose, who had been both the former full-time JLM director and prior to that, an officer in the Israeli embassy itself. Not only did Ware and the BBC neglect to mention any of these facts, it didn't even name Ella Rose or reveal that she was a leading member of a partisan anti-Corbyn group, the JLM. Neither did they reveal the same information about any of the other JLM interviewees. One of them, her name is Izzy Lenger, she is now a councillor, a Labour councillor in North London, had even once trained in a military combat camp with the Israeli army itself. You can see this old photo of her here with a rifle uniform and flag. I revealed this for the Electronic Intifada back in 2021. A previous episode of Panorama, fronted by Ware in 2006 as well, also relied on heavily on Israeli spy sources. That episode was called Faith, Hate and Charity, and its main target was a charity, a group called INTIFAD'S, which is a British charity focused on aid to Palestinians. And that episode drew heavily on interviews with Reuven Paz, a former senior Shin Bet officer. Again, the main target of the documentary was Hamas, the Palestinian resistance group. But as well as the dubious Israeli narratives it was spinning, Ware's latest anti-Palestinian episode of Panorama on Monday was also conspicuous by the things that it didn't mention. A planned UK angle in the episode appears to have been dropped shortly before publication, after the Electronic Intifada exposed Ware's plans. In my article on the 9th of February, I revealed how Ware and Panorama had initially intended the episode to focus its attacks on Palestinians and Muslims in Britain, alleging the support of several prominent activists for Hamas and for what it called terror. I learned of at least 4 such Palestinian and Muslim public figures who had been approached for comment by Panorama producer Leo Telling in late January. I've since learned of 2 others, making a total of at least 6 Palestinian or Muslim campaigners that Panorama approached for comment, but ultimately did not include in the program. Here is one of the letters that the producer Leo Telling sent out. 2 of the recipients came forward and spoke on the record to me. The prominent British Iraqi campaigner and broadcaster Anas Al-Takriti, and Azam Tamimi, a British Palestinian academic and broadcaster who has written 2 books about Hamas. Addressing both men in very similar terms, Leo Telling, the producer, asserted that the program, quote, may include evidence of the support you have voiced for Hamas, which, as you know, is designated as a terror group by the UK government, end of quote. As evidence of such so-called support for terror, the producer cited 4 posts to X, formerly Twitter, by Al-Takriti, where he called into question some of Israel's most high-profile atrocity propaganda about the Palestinian military assault that began on the 7th of October. These Israeli narratives, such as the now completely debunked fabrication about 40 beheaded babies, have been widely discredited and called into question across the world, not least on this live stream. Addressing Tamimi instead of Twitter posts, producer Telling cited public talks Tamimi had made, which had been posted to YouTube. In those talks, Tamimi emphasized that Hamas are, quote, a Muslim movement. They train their members on Islamic values before they train them on resistance tactics. And they are told that in warfare in Islam, you don't ever harm non-combatants. Tamimi accused Israel of lying propaganda. He said that, quote, the Israeli story about the 7th of October that was marketed to the Westerners was mostly lies. They claim that Hamas went in, killed civilians and beheaded babies, and it's nonsense. Crucially, the letters requesting comment from the BBC indicated that the program was going to attempt to revive the debunked Israeli narrative about Palestinian fighters supposedly carrying out a campaign of mass rape against Israelis, with an implied criticism against these British Muslim figures for pointing out that this narrative is a lie, to boot. But as we've repeatedly shown on this live stream, there remains 0 credible evidence that even 1 rape by Palestinians took place on the 7th of October. and there is still no named victim of such an incident. High-profile Israeli and corporate media claims about an alleged campaign of mass rape have repeatedly fallen apart upon closer examination. A much-hyped New York Times article by Jeffrey Gettleman from December titled "Screams Without Words" has been repudiated by the family of Gal Abdush, the Israeli woman at the center of the story. Her family took to Israeli media soon after the Times' story was published to say that actually there was no evidence to show that Abdush was raped before she died, and that the Times had misled them as to the true nature of the story they intended to write before they participated. Gettleman's article has sparked growing dissent even within the Times newsroom. An episode of the paper's high-profile podcast, The Daily, based on his reporting, was scrapped before broadcast amid a furious internal debate about the strength of the paper's original reporting on the subject, The Intercept revealed. The graphic Israeli claim that producer Leo Telling put to Tamimi and Al-Takriti about alleged mutilation of an Israeli woman's breast very closely resembled a fiction-like account put forward in the discredited Times piece. In our emails to the BBC, John Ware and Panorama's Leo Telling requested comment for our story. We put all this to them, including the fact that the claims about mass rape and mutilation of women, which they were apparently taking from the Times story, had been discredited. They declined to comment on their then forthcoming program, but it's notable that in the end, they dropped these claims almost entirely. In the final program, Ware did claim to have seen, quote, graphic evidence of sexual violence and attempted beheadings by Hamas while showing two almost totally blurred out videos, one provided by the Israeli army. This seems intended to give the impression that the video, underneath the blurring, showed evidence of sexual assault by Palestinian fighters. Yet no such video exists, and Ware didn't admit that. Panorama also dropped the claim about the mutilation of the women, which the discredited Times story that the BBC's letters requesting comment had alluded to. Neither Tamimi nor Takriti formally responded to Telling's letters, citing Ware's history of what they described as discredited journalism, but they did post to X, sounded the alarm about the program. This assertive and proactive strategy seems to have paid off. They were not mentioned in the program at all, and neither were the other 4 Palestinians and Muslims who were approached for comment by Panorama for the program. It's possible that the whole thing was a red herring and a distraction, or perhaps a fishing expedition. It's also not impossible that Ware has decided to save his dubious research on the British activists for another project. But for now, at least, it does appear that fighting back can work. Perhaps that's the lesson that Corbyn's Labour Party never took on board.
Thank you so much for that, Asa. And we'll have that cut into a separate segment. Yeah, I'm assuming you're also going to blog about it, Asa. So
yeah.
Can I just say, I mean, that's brilliant, Asa. And as someone who's also followed this story of Israeli atrocity propaganda and the lies about mass rape, I think we can take credit. You know, it's just my opinion, but I think your story at the Electronic Intifada and your inquiries to the BBC actually forced them to drop a lot of what they were planning to put in that program. It put them on alert that we're watching closely and that it's not so easy to get away with these lies anymore. So I think it would have been a very different episode of Panorama that would have been seen in millions of households across the UK and around the world had you and the Electronic Intifada not preemptively reported on this and challenged them about their lies. So I just think that's brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine that it would have been the same program. I think you're right, and you know, it's always, you know, as reporters, it's always hard to know. I mean, you want your reporting to have an impact, it's kind of hard to know sometimes whether something has made an impact or not. So
Look,
it's good to see.
Yeah, but you know, they are used to getting away with the lies, you know, and we talked about this a few weeks ago when the Washington Post came after us and did that big smear piece. It's because, you know, the reason that the Washington Post wouldn't have bothered paying attention to us if we weren't having an impact. I mean, it would be nice if John Ware were to send an email and say, I had to change my whole program because of the Electronic Intifada's reporting, but he's not going to do that. So we have to put two and two together. And I really do think that your reporting had an impact, and that we are having an impact, and it shows that there is value and importance to all of us, not just the Electronic Intifada as a publication or other independent outlets, but individuals challenging this thing and letting the media mouthpieces of power know that we're not taken in by their lies anymore, and they can't get away with it like they used to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, I mean, credit to Asa Winstanley and Asa Winstanley 𝐤𝐿, because you know, it was them who approached me and said, you know, look, this is, I wouldn't have been able to learn the story if they hadn't decided, if they just sort of quietly decided, oh, you know, I'm going to ignore John Ware by themselves, or you know, just responded in a certain way, like maybe perhaps in a meek way. I wouldn't have been able to have done the story. You know, it was up to them to actually be more assertive and say, you know, we're not going to accept this, and therefore I can do the story. You know, that kind of assertive responses, I think, is what is needed, really. Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, leave a comment. These engagements help us with the YouTube algorithm, and it helps us to get around Silicon Valley censorship as much as possible. It does make a difference. You can also support our journalism by going to electronicintifada.net and clicking on Donate Now. Thank you.